In this video, we will look at independent and dependent variable. Let's look at the definition. So we have independent variable is the input variable. Let me circle that you can control, while the dependent variable is the output variable. You don't control the dependent variable, it changes as the independent variable changes. So imagine that there is like a machine or a box, yeah? And inside that machine, you put in something. What you put into that machine is your independent variable. Yeah, that's your input variable. And what comes out of that machine as an output is your dependent variable. So the dependent variable depends on the input variable. All you can control is the independent variable, and the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So in algebra, x is used to represent an independent variable in an equation or a graph, and y is used to represent a dependent variable in an equation or a graph. Let's now look at some examples. Let's look at this graph. This graph tells us that we're going on a road trip, and the x-axis is the number of hours and the y-axis is the distance in miles. And it's plotting how much distance we go for the different number of hours. We've seen earlier that x usually represents the independent variable. So this is our independent variable. Let's write that down here. Independent variable is the number of hours. And y represents the dependent variable, which is distance in miles. Again, let's write that down. So the dependent variable is the distance in miles. Let's see if that makes sense. So when you go for 2 hours, you end up going 60 miles. Yeah. What if you go for a longer time? What if you go for 5 hours? Then you would end up going 150 miles. So the distance that you go depends on the number of hours that you travel, which is why the distance is the dependent variable. It kind of makes sense now. Let's look at this table. This table tells us the relationship between the cost of markers in dollars and the number of markers. They don't quite tell us which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. But if you think about it, the cost in dollars depends on how many markers you buy. So when you buy 2 markers, you end up spending $4.50. But when you buy 8 markers, you end up spending much more, that is $18. So in this case, even though they don't tell you what is the independent and dependent variable, you can figure out using your everyday knowledge that the cost depends on the number of things that you buy. So the independent variable is the number of markers. Let me write that down. Number of markers. And the dependent variable is the cost in dollars, because the cost or how much you spend will depend on the number of markers you buy. You buy no markers, you end up spending no money at all. What do we have here? They're telling you that you plan to bake cookies, and the recipe says that you need 2 tablespoons of butter for every 3 cups of flour. So both the butter and the flour are ingredients that go into baking your cookies. How do we now decide which is your independent and which is your dependent variable? Now, if you think about it, when you're baking cookies, what you usually decide first is the amount of flour you need. So that becomes your independent variable. Your independent variable would be whatever you decide first. In this case, when you're baking cookies, your independent variable would be the cups of flour or amount of flour. And your dependent variable would be the amount of butter that you would use. So tablespoons of butter or just amount of butter. The amount of butter that you would end up using will depend on the cups of flour that you take. So imagine that you took 6 cups of flour, in which case you will need 4 tablespoons of butter. But if you took only half of that, if you took only 3 cups of flour, then you will need only 2 tablespoons of butter. So far, we have seen 3 different situations where we had to decide which is the independent and which is the dependent variable.